The sky tore apart with the roar of the storm, a violent flash of lightning cutting the world in half. Juana Maria felt the ground tremble beneath her feet as the ocean, once a familiar, soothing presence, turned into a beast, a chaotic, thrashing force that demanded nothing short of surrender. The waves rose like mountains, crashing against the jagged cliffs with a deafening fury. She clung to the craggy rock with every ounce of strength, her fingers raw and bloodied, her heart racing with a primal fear. She had watched it all unfold. The boats, small canoes crafted from the island's gnarled wood, had been tossed by the sea, one by one, as though they were mere toys in the hands of a cruel god. Her tribe, the Nicolinos, had been making their way back to the mainland, the last few families loaded into the remaining boats. Juana Maria, however, had been left behind, caught in the chaos, swept up by the storm's violence. Her people, her family, had gone. The island was silent now, save for the roar of the storm. Alone. She staggered back from the cliff's edge, her body trembling as she collapsed against the rough, wind-swept earth. Her mind raced. The tribe's departure had been sudden, and the storm's ferocity had made escape impossible. She was stranded, on an island that was both a haven and a prison. A harsh beauty. The towering cliffs surrounded her, their stark, jagged edges like broken teeth jutting out of the earth. The vegetation was sparse here, twisted cacti and dry grasses that scratched at her skin as she pushed through. She could see nothing but the remnants of the storm, the debris scattered across the rocky shore, and the overwhelming silence that had fallen in its wake. It was a silence that spoke of loss, of isolation. A silence that would soon become a companion she could not escape. Juana Maria knew the island. She had grown up here, after all. Her people had lived on San Nicolas for as long as anyone could remember. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but it had always offered what they needed: shelter, food, a place to survive. Yet, now, it felt unfamiliar. Alone, she was nothing more than a fragile creature adrift in the harsh wilderness. The survival skills passed down through generations, the knowledge of the tides, the seasons, the edible plants, those were her only weapons now. She took a deep breath, pushing away the panic that rose in her throat. First things first. Shelter. She would need shelter. There were caves along the cliffs, and if she could find one, she might be able to wait out the storm. But the storm was still raging. The wind was too fierce, and the rain fell like a curtain of ice. The sea roared below, and every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of the dark shapes of the waves crashing against the shore. The island's beauty, which she had once found so calming, now felt like an alien thing. It was a place that could offer comfort, but it could also kill you if you weren't prepared. And she was alone now, there was no one to help her, no one to watch her back. With great effort, she forced herself to her feet and began moving toward the cliffs, her bare feet finding purchase on the rocky terrain. She could do this. She had to. Her mind raced with memories of her family, of the rituals and practices that had been taught to her as a child. The fires, the fishing, the gathering of herbs, the knowledge was ingrained in her. But there was a difference now. The certainty of survival when surrounded by the tribe was gone. The solitary path to survival lay in her hands alone. She stumbled along the rocky path that led up toward the cliffs, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Her body ached with exhaustion, her muscles sore from the long hours of scrambling against the storm. But there was no time for rest, not yet. The storm might pass, but the dangers of the island would remain, and she needed to prepare for what was to come. By the time she reached the mouth of the cave, her hands were raw, her body bruised. She crawled inside, her breath coming in ragged bursts, her thoughts scattered. The cave was dark, the smell of damp earth and sea salt thick in the air. But it was shelter. It was protection from the worst of the storm. She huddled in the back of the cave, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to calm the frantic beat of her heart. She could still hear the wind screaming outside, but at least here, she was safe from the element. The storm would pass, but would she survive long enough to see it? Suddenly, there was a sharp crack outside, a terrifying sound that made Juana Maria's blood run cold. The air shifted. A shadow passed across the mouth of the cave. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held her breath, praying it was nothing. But she knew better. The island had its creatures, wild things that roamed the cliffs and the forests, unseen and often deadly. She had learned the signs of danger as a child, and the sound outside wasn't one of the island's usual denizens. Something far larger, more dangerous, was close. The island was beautiful, but it was unforgiving. It had always been that way, and now Juana Maria was discovering just how deadly it could be. The storm raged on, but inside the cave, Juana Maria's mind was focused on something else: survival. She had to survive. As she lay there, listening for the creature, she knew that her fight had only just begun. Her fingers brushed the sharp edges of the rocks near her. She felt them, tested them, knowing that what happened next could determine whether she lived or died. The shadow loomed again, and with it, the deep, guttural growl of something far more dangerous than any animal she had faced before. Cliffhanger. The shadow at the mouth of the cave is a threat that could end Juana Maria's life. With the storm outside still raging and the unknown danger growing closer, Juana must make a choice: fight or flee. The growl outside the cave sent a chill through Juana Maria's bones, her heart thundering in her chest as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows. The darkness of the cave seemed to close in around her, its suffocating quietness in stark contrast to the violent storm still raging outside. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run from the danger lurking just beyond the cave's entrance. But where would she go? The island offered no sanctuary beyond these cliffs, no other place to hide. She had faced wild animals before. They had been part of her world, part of the lessons she had learned from the elders. But this, whatever was out there, it wasn't a simple predator. The growl echoed again, low and menacing, reverberating through the rocks like thunder. She could almost feel the weight of it, a tangible presence just beyond the reach of her senses. Her hand instinctively reached for the sharp-edged rocks by her side. She had no weapon, no spear or blade, nothing but the raw materials of the island itself. But she knew how to make do. Juana Maria had grown up learning to craft tools from bones and stone, to fashion what she needed from the harsh resources of the land. It was all she had now. She grasped the jagged rock with both hands, her fingers finding a firm hold, its weight steady and reassuring. The growl came again, louder this time, and this time she heard it move, something heavy, its breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever it was circling the cave, waiting for her to make a move. Juana Maria's muscles tensed, her body frozen in a mix of fear and focus. The shadow outside the cave shifted again, and then, nothing. Silence. The stillness was suffocating. She strained to hear, to catch any movement outside the cave, but there was nothing, only the howling wind and the distant roar of the storm. It was as if the island itself had fallen silent in anticipation. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time had no meaning anymore. The island had swallowed it all, swallowed her tribe, swallowed her old life, and now it was swallowing her fear. Juana Maria took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. She was alone, but she was also strong. The island had tried to claim her already, but she wasn't ready to be claimed. Not yet. Slowly, she inched toward the cave's mouth, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Her senses were heightened now, every sound, every movement amplified. She could feel the presence of the creature even though she couldn't see it. It was out there, waiting. She leaned cautiously against the cold rock, her breath shallow as she peered through a small crack in the cave's entrance. Her heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the threshold, stood the creature. Its large, muscular form was partially obscured by the shadows, but the glow from the storm's occasional flashes of lightning revealed enough to make her blood run cold. It was a wild boar, its tusks gleaming white like daggers in the darkness, its beady eyes reflecting the storm's fury. Juana Maria had seen boars before, heard their grunts as they searched the forest for food. But never had she seen one so close, so aggressive. Its large, powerful frame was a weapon in itself, and its tusks, sharp and menacing, would tear through flesh with ease. She had no doubt that it could kill her with a single charge. Her mind raced. There were no tools, no weapons. The only advantage she had was her knowledge of the land. She knew the island's creatures, its rhythms, its dangers. But this boar was not a regular threat. It was driven by hunger, by desperation, just as she was. She wasn't the only one on this island anymore, and that thought sent a new wave of dread through her. If the boar was this close, others might follow. It would only take one wrong move to bring them all crashing down on her. Her hand tightened around the stone, her fingers aching from the pressure. There was no time to hesitate. She had to act. The storm outside reached its peak, the wind howling and the rain pelting the earth like needles. A flash of lightning illuminated the dark cave, and in that brief, blinding moment, Juana Maria saw the boar's eyes glinting in the darkness. Without thinking, she lunged forward, her stone raised high, her body propelled by sheer instinct. The boar let out a snarl, its body shifting as it saw her movement. But it was too late. Juana Maria's stone came down with a brutal force, striking the creature just below its ear. The blow was wild, desperate, but it connected. The boar grunted in pain, stumbling backward, disoriented by the sudden strike. The fight was far from over. The boar reared up, its tusks aimed directly at her. She could feel the earth tremble beneath the force of its movements. With a roar, it charged, its speed terrifying in its raw, animal fury. In that instant, Juana Maria's mind cleared. She dropped the stone and bolted, her legs carrying her across the cave floor as fast as they could move. She ducked as the boar's tusks sliced through the air just inches from her skin. She could hear the creature's heavy breath behind her, could feel its hot, rancid breath as it closed the distance. Her only option was to escape, to get out of the cave, to lead it away, to somehow turn the tables. She darted to the side, her feet slipping on the wet rock as she made for the narrow opening of the cave. The storm outside raged, but she didn't care. She needed space, she needed air. The boar charged again, and Juana Maria could hear the crash of its massive body against the stone. Then, a sound. A crack. The cave wall, weakened by the relentless wind and rain, began to crumble. In the distance, the sound of rocks tumbling into the sea echoed through the night. Cliffhanger. The cave's entrance begins to collapse as the boar closes in. Juana Maria must escape before the falling debris seals her fate. The ground beneath Juana Maria's feet trembled as she scrambled through the narrow cave opening. Rocks tumbled from above, the rumble of their descent drowned out only by the roar of the storm outside. The boar, enraged by the blow, charged again, but Juana Maria was already halfway through the jagged gap, her body wedged between stone and earth. She barely fit. The world was collapsing around her, the ceiling of the cave falling in pieces, but there was no choice, she had to move. The sharp scent of wet earth and salt water filled her lungs as she forced herself to the other side, her body twisting uncomfortably as she pushed forward. The cave's mouth loomed large in her mind as she clutched at the rocks, each movement slower than the last, the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. Finally, she was free, though only by inches. As she crawled from the cave, the storm slapped her face with ferocity. The rain poured down, blinding her as she rolled onto the wet ground. Her hands found the slippery rocks, her nails scraped raw. Every part of her body was screaming, aching, bruised, cut. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she staggered to her feet, looking around for any sign of the boar. The storm swallowed the world whole, casting everything into a deep, chaotic night. She was alone again. For a moment, the only thing Juana Maria could hear was her own breathing. Each gasping breath seemed to fill the space around her, drowning out the storm's roar. The boar was gone. Had it retreated back into the jungle, or was it stalking her, waiting to strike again? Her body was trembling, not just from the cold and exhaustion but from the overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The island had become a living, breathing thing in her mind, each gust of wind and crashing wave a reminder of how small and insignificant she was in the face of nature's raw power. But the boar was only one danger in a sea of them. She had survived this fight, but what about the next? And the next after that? The storm continued to rage, but Juana Maria knew she could not wait for it to pass. She had to move. She had to find shelter, true shelter this time. The cave had been only a brief reprieve, a temporary haven that had almost cost her everything. The wild boar was a predator, but she was no longer just a survivor, she was becoming something else. A creature of the island, one with the land, learning its rhythms, its moods. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her mind. She had to focus. Her eyes scanned the horizon, and then her gaze dropped to the ground. The island was treacherous, but there were signs. The faint trails through the sand left by animals, the shape of the land that led toward higher ground. The mountains. She had to climb, get away from the shore. That was where the real shelter would be. Hidden caves in the hills, perhaps, where no animal could reach her, where she could regain some sense of control. But her journey up the cliffs would be brutal. The wind was unforgiving, the rocks sharp as knives, and the path would likely be unstable. And yet, she felt the stirrings of resolve deep within her. She would survive. She began her climb, each step a battle against the element. Her hands were slick with rain, the stones slippery underfoot, but she moved steadily, slowly. Her fingers, raw from the earlier struggle, ached with every grip, every shift of her weight. But she did not stop. The island was alive with sound, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, the eerie whistle of the wind through the jagged rocks. Juana Maria's thoughts wandered in the isolation, slipping deeper and deeper into a space where memories and grief began to consume her. The faces of her people, her family, flashed in her mind. Her mother's laughter, her father's calm voice, the warmth of the fires they had shared at night. They were gone now. The tribe had left, sailing across the endless horizon, and she had been left behind. She had never felt more alone. Her eyes burned with the salt of the ocean air, and the sting of tears she could not shed. How long had it been since the storm had hit? A day? More? It felt like weeks. She could no longer remember what the sound of voices had felt like, or the sensation of being part of a community. She was alone, truly alone, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her chest. The isolation gnawed at her, eating away at her resolve. There were moments when she wanted to scream, to give in to the despair that beckoned from the shadows. Her thoughts spiraled, questioning whether she would ever see another human face again. Would she die here, a nameless figure lost to time, forgotten by the world? Would the island claim her, just as it had claimed so many before? Her mind swirled with memories of her tribe's departure. The faces of those who had been her family, her community. Had they seen her? Had they known she was still here? Or had they thought her lost to the storm? The questions echoed in her mind, but there was no answer. The climb was taking its toll. Her arms and legs felt like lead, her muscles screaming for rest. Yet, the higher she climbed, the clearer the air became, the more space there was between herself and the crushing weight of the sea. The winds grew fiercer, but they also brought the smell of something different, something familiar. The scent of trees, of life, of shelter. At the crest of the cliff, she saw it. A small grove of trees, dense and hidden in the shadows of the mountains. The canopy above them was thick, shielding them from the worst of the storm. Shelter. But even as she felt a spark of hope, a voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. The island was vast, and as much as she had learned, as much as she had adapted, there were still things here that she did not understand, things that could kill her just as easily as the boar had. There was no peace here. Not yet. The storm's fury seemed to intensify as she reached the grove, the wind howling around the trees. But within the small clearing there was a stillness, a silence that allowed her to think, to gather herself. And then, as she caught her breath, there was a sound, a rustling in the undergrowth. Cliffhanger. Juana Maria freezes as a shadow moves through the trees. Another presence, another danger? The shadow moved again. For a moment, Juana Maria's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as the rustling in the underbrush grew louder. Was it the boar? Another predator? Or something far worse, something unknown? Her hand instinctively reached for the crude stone knife she had crafted earlier, its edges jagged but sharp. She crouched low, her muscles tense, her senses alert. The storm was a constant roar around her, but in this moment, everything was still, focused on the rustling that seemed to be coming closer. And then, as the shape emerged from the shadows, Juana Maria's breath caught in her chest, not with fear, but with confusion. It was not a wild animal, not a threat, but a figure, a person. She blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. The figure was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, their hair wild and unkempt from the storm. The man, or woman, moved with the same cautious steps she had learned to take in the wild, each motion deliberate, as though aware of the danger of this place. For a long moment they stood there, eyes locked across the clearing. Juana Maria's mind raced. She hadn't seen another human being in so long that she had forgotten the shape of another soul. She had forgotten what it was like to stand with someone, to feel their presence. She had forgotten what it meant to share the weight of the world. The figure took another step, closer now, and Juana Maria's heart pounded. She couldn't trust this, couldn't trust anyone here. The island had turned everything upside down, twisted her perception of reality. How could she be sure this person was real, or if it was just a figment of her desperate mind? The wind howled again, shaking the branches above them. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move back. Instead, they extended their hand, their voice a soft, almost pleading whisper, "I'm not here to harm you." The words were strange, foreign. A language she hadn't heard in years. Juana Maria didn't move. Her eyes flickered over the figure, trying to discern their intentions, trying to read the emotions etched into their face. She had no choice but to be cautious. The island had made her this way. But the offer, an offer of companionship, of connection, felt so powerful that it left her breathless. She had not realized how deeply she had longed for another human.